I guess we can just get started. So today we have a presentation by Rudy Schuster and Kyle Portman, right? And they're over here from USGS. They're in the room along with Nina and a bunch of other folks. And so if you want to maybe introduce Kyle, since he's kind of your new...
Well, you can introduce yourself, Kyle.
Hey, my name's Kyle Portman. I just moved here to Colorado. I guess I have to get closer here. No, I just moved here to Colorado, in August, and I work on this Human Dimensions of Climate Change project. I've been a lot of places before, most recently at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. But anyway, so we've got a cool presentation for you. Hopefully it's cool. Yeah, that's me.
Okay. So, Rudy Schuster here at the USGS, here in Fort Collins. Also with us, Nina Burkhardt is part of this project as well, and I think Dan Williams is on the phone. He's part of this project. I'm not sure if any of our other collaborators have called in yet today. But the Human Dimensions of Climate Change is, we call it an Interagency Collaborative, and as you can see the logos down there, we have a number of folks who've been talking about this and trying to do something associated with this for a few years now. I have to, without naming all of the names, I'll just quickly say that a lot of this has been funded through Rob Winthrop and Karen Blakeney with the Bureau of Land Management. They've ponied up the dollars to actually make the rubber hit the road, along with some USGS funding associated with this too. Can you hit the next button there? Didn't go anywhere. Oh, there we are. Okay. Yeah. So the brief history of this is that for a few years now, some of us have been getting together, or a few years ago, some of us got together and said, well, what can we do very specific for public land managers in light of climate change? Helping managers and policymakers make decisions associated with the human dimensions, the social science side of climate change. The idea being, a little bit of preaching to the choir here. We know the climate is changing. We know things are happening. We know there are impacts on all of our resources. And, taking the social ecological perspective, we know that there's a human dimension, a set of human dimensions associated with all of these things. And so we want to do something to help the people on the ground at all levels. On the ground, the refuge manager, the BLM manager, the park manager, the people who have to actually make decisions on the ground, all the way up to larger scale policy decisions. So when, preaching to the choir, what are the human dimensions, the social ecological system? There's a nice little brief and incomplete list down there, but the idea being all of these things, we're trying to take this perspective, look at it, and what are the data needs, the information, the social science needs on the front end of these things to facilitate decisions throughout the model. What are the impacts of the management actions to the social system afterward? Trying to help managers see this perspective a little bit larger. Next, please. So we came up with some really wonderful things that we'd like to be able to do. One thing is help set up communities of practice for public land managers, decision makers, and stakeholders associated with land management and human dimensions related decisions. The idea being that these folks are not operating alone, and so if we can connect to these people in some way and help them exchange information, it will help. I mean, this is not a new idea. This is something that we're talking about. We'd like to actually make a place for this stuff to happen. If there's a forum where people can exchange information, so maybe even take the physical form of a database where there are case studies, where there are data sets, where there's examples of other things people have done, good things, bad things, a place where folks can go that are in need of information. And when we think about the types of people who need this information, we're trying to think of, within a community of practice, there are the people who live there, right? The people who do this stuff for a living. They understand social science or the application of social science. They deal with it on a regular basis. But also in the public land management realm, there are a lot of people who are plugging into this community as a one-time visitor, so to speak. There could be a refuge manager or a park service person who's charged with writing part of their management plan that includes a social science or human dimension aspect, and they're a fish biologist or something, but it's part of what they have to do today and what's part of their assignment. Well, where do they go to get information? So they can plug into this community of practice, hopefully find a forum where they can get information. And the big picture, you know, the more I think about a common framework, the more impossible it seems, because, you know, what is a common framework for human dimensions, public land management in light of climate change in North America and Alaska and a couple of other places that we like to manage. So the idea here is we're going to start talking about scaling, but the idea that if people are talking to each other, we can get some common practices and
Sarah Strauss.
Go there. Can you go to next, please?
Yep.
There we go. So how do we go about doing these things of communities of practice, a forum, and common practices? Well, yes, North America, Alaska, and a bunch of other places we like to manage is a very daunting task. So we've decided to do something realistic, and that is carve out smaller locations, case studies, where we can actually do those things on a smaller scale. And if we can roll it out in a couple of different places and start working in different areas, well, then you can roll up and start thinking about common practices and forums and communities of practice across those areas. So what we're doing, the first location that we've selected to jump in the pilot is the upper Rio Grande River Basin, a little bit larger. Kyle's going to talk a little bit more about the details of that. We're looking at a couple of locations in Alaska. Everyone knows and loves the climate issues up there. Pretty easy, low-hanging fruit, so to speak. We've also targeted a few places, coastal Oregon and Washington, where we're writing proposals. You know, again, it's always a funding game. We have the pilot that we're working on right now, and the idea is if we, you know, nail the method now, we can roll it out and make it even better in these other locations. So now I'll turn it over to Kyle here to talk about the details of the workshops.
Thanks, Rudy, and thanks, everyone, for being on the call, and thanks for having us. Let me give you just a bit of an overview about our pilot study in the Rio Grande area. It's the upper middle Rio Grande River Basin, and we used the hydrologic units, 2 hydrologic units, to define this scope. And you can see it on the map here, and this is actually from CSU's own Faith Sternlieb, and she helped us out with the project, so we want to thank Faith. She's not on the call. She's in Israel, but, you know, thanks to Faith for that. So as you can see, the study area spans from southern Colorado all the way down to southern New Mexico. It's about 80,000 square miles, and about 1/4 of that is federally managed land. And about 15,000 square miles of that is the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. And then the third largest land manager is the Department of Defense, and mostly that's in the southern part of the area there around White Sands. So there's significant federal presence, and it's also quite interesting area in the fact that there is a very large population center, and almost all population in New Mexico is in the study area and around Albuquerque. So about 1 million people live in Metro Albuquerque, and it's growing. It grew by about 20% over the last 10 years. It's going to grow about 20 more percent. So this area is also, you know, it's water scarce, and there will be more people, so there's significant issues there. On the climate front, projections over the next century, almost all the models that we've seen project a significant increase in temperature. Actually, the absolute largest increases will happen in this region over the entire 48 states. So largest temperature increase in this area. The models are mixed on precipitation, but most of them agree that precipitation will decrease slightly, but the precipitation mix will change. And that's significant for the region because snowpack will be less, there'll be more rain. Counterintuitively, there will actually be less precipitation but more floods because of the changing mix in precipitation. So we got most of our data from the Bureau of Reclamation on our future scenarios. The Bureau's done some downscaled models on this region, mostly around water, obviously, but most of their models they rely on are from NASA, but the work was done by the Bureau of Reclamation. Okay, so that's a little bit about the study area. Now let's talk about what we're actually doing with the case study. So we're dealing with kind of two things. Oh, sorry, I just want to back up just for a second and go over our goals for the case study. So our goals are fourfold. We want to identify management issues and identify human factors of those management issues. We want to assess the scientific information availability and ability to implement management decisions. We want to devise recommendations related to gaps and barriers that occur with regard to information and implementation of policy or management decisions. And then we want to address a set of local level gaps and barriers. Okay, so I'm going to start off with management issue. What's a management issue? A management issue is something that we're thinking about as kind of an overarching issue. And that could be wildfire, it could be grazing. We have identified upwards of 20 management issues in our secondary research. And so if you think about that as the overarching issue, but we really want to get deeper than that. So we want to actually get to the human factors of that management issue. So an example of a human factor might be the the economic impact of drought with relation to a management issue, which would be water scarcity. So the human factors are those economic impacts. So we want to identify management issues, and then we want to go lower and identify human factors. So there could be a whole bunch of factors, biophysical factors, species factors, but in our study, we want to deal with human factors, okay? And so to kind of get at our goals, we're going to do workshops, probably around 4 workshops, and we're going to solicit information from land managers, interested parties, people who are dealing with land and waters management issues. And we're actually going to, first of all, solicit what they're actually dealing with. Because, okay, so we've done secondary research and we've come up with these management issues that we think are happening in the region, but we are actually going to solicit them from land managers to actually get a picture of that. And we're also going to go deeper and get those human factors. And how we're going to do that, I'm going to explain in a second. So in the workshops, we are interested in doing a gap and barrier analysis. And to do that, we're going to use something called an importance performance tool. And an importance performance tool actually is pretty simple. We're going to ask a couple questions, and it's going to immediately tell us where there are some gaps in information, or where there's a policy or decision barrier, or where there's some good works going on. So we're using this tool in the workshop, and I'll go through that in a second. And in the workshops, we will also be asking about future information needs with regard to climate change. So I just want to step through the 3 things that we're going to do in the work, the 3 activities that we envision in the workshop.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question?
Yes.
Who are you inviting to these workshops?
We're looking at stakeholders in general. So land managers, they could be academic folks. We want to focus on land management issues and provide information to land managers, but we don't want to be exclusive, because we know that a lot of the information that land managers use are tied to academicians or non-governmental organizations. So we're open to stakeholders. And
so it's not just going to be focused on federal managers.
Correct. Correct. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Pretty broad.
Yes.
So we envision 3 activities in our workshops: an issue identification, issue elaboration, and a climate futures question. So I just want to go through the first one, which is issue identification. All right. So here we bring in the 3 questions for issue identification. Okay. We bring in an importance question, a scientific information question, and a barriers question. And we're going to use 2 of these questions and then 2 of these questions. So we reuse the importance question, and then we couple it with either the scientific information question or the barriers question. Okay? So we ask the participants, how important is the human factor in making decisions associated with the management issue? Okay? So in this case, we're going to ask the workshop participants to come up with, first of all, what they're dealing with, an overarching management issue, let's say water scarcity, and then the human factor, which would be, economic impacts of drought. So then you could rewrite the question saying, how important is economic impacts of drought in making decisions associated with water scarcity? And then so we'll ask them that question. That's the importance question. Then we'll go to assess the status of scientific information that is available for the economic impacts of drought associated with water scarcity. I obviously put in the example there. So anyway, so we've asked them 2 questions, and I'm just going to say, okay, I'm going to answer the questions. I'm going to say for the importance question, it's critically important. It's a 4. And, I have limited information about this, so it's a 1. So then this is where the importance performance comes in. We can immediately go to this grid right here, and we can say, okay, it's a 4, it's critically important, and it's a 1, we don't have that much information. It immediately falls in the gap area, okay? So this is the gap analysis. We're not just interested in gaps, although I think we'll get a lot of gaps. But we're not just interested in gaps. We're also very much interested in, every quadrant, but the good work quadrant is also a very important one here, okay? Because the good work quadrant can be spread across the country, or it could, learning could happen in the room and say, for example, a person may think that there's a gap there, but we actually have another manager, another interested party who says, hey, actually, we're doing this good work, and you should think about, X. So we have this kind of local level learning that could occur.
So do you anticipate this being sort of a matrix, because you're going to have multi-dimensional gaps, right, depending on the stakeholder, type of physical attribute, gaps kind of, the general concept of gap just lends itself. I mean, there's just multiple dimensions.
Yeah. Well, and they'll be different for different stakeholders.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we
talk about how you
That's the issue elaboration point.
Yeah. There was a question up there from Lisa.
Brian, can you do me a favor and monitor so on your laptop, just look at your laptop.
Oh, and my screen doesn't work.
Yeah. Oh.
It's up there from the green thing.
Yeah.
Sorry guys, I'm not in front of my laptop, so I'm not seeing the.
There we go. Does the matrix assume that science is always needed for?
The question is, does the matrix assume that science is always needed for decisions? Good question. Because it's information. It's not just scientific information, it's information. So if somebody has enough information to make a relevant decision, then there's robust information. It doesn't matter if it's, data that was collected scientifically or expert knowledge and opinion for a specific topic, I guess. So,
but
we are trying to target.
I would assume that most things will need scientific information.
But is it part of the question how the person who's answering that interprets scientific information? Because I've had a lot of managers talk about they have experiential knowledge, but not necessarily scientific.
Good point.
Yes. Yep. Okay. So yeah, that's a good thing. Thanks for bringing that up. We'll make sure that during the discussion that we're not, we do mean information, and regardless of whether it's scientific information versus some other form.
Because in a sense, we've been talking about this issue as knowledge sharing, and so it's the broader set of information.
Right. So Lisa's asking a good question, which is, are the barriers just in relation to science and information and knowledge barriers, or broader barriers of like policy, regulatory,
much
economic?
broader.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't see this.
The barriers get into all this sort of stuff. So it might be that maybe it's really important and you have good information, but there still could be barriers to using it, right? And those could be institutional, political, lots of different things. Maybe something's important, you don't have information, and maybe in that case there are actually barriers to getting information. Yeah. Maybe you don't have money to do the studies you think you need. Maybe there's a lot of disagreement about what the science says, and nobody can really move forward because they can't decide what studies they might want to use to help them make a decision, that kind of thing. So yeah, the barriers. Does that answer your question? Barriers are multi-subject.
Yeah. Yes.
Does that answer your question, Lisa?
You might be muted, Lisa.
Oh, sorry, I forgot I actually can talk too. I was thinking I had to type it in. Yeah, no, that answers it. I guess I was just trying to relate the slide before and this slide, and this slide really does. This matrix really is about information. I'm just trying to figure out if there's a part of the quadrant where science isn't the problem. In other words, science isn't the issue. Is that covered in this matrix, or is this not about that kind of a situation?
So there's two. So we're asking 3 questions, but we're only using 2 in this grid.
Gotcha.
So if we go back to the 3rd question, how do barriers affect the implementation of management decisions? Then we go to this next one, which is which we don't have
the general barriers. Then
right. Exactly. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So.
But the one before that you were on is strictly just related to the taking from as a granted sort of that science information is important in some way, and you're trying to figure out how the science information situation is how it is basically in the
correct.
Before.
Yeah, that's the science or information gap part of it, trying to identify where can we help facilitate getting information for people to use.
Gotcha. And there might be some situations you encounter where it isn't about, and there's no kind of science that could really make any difference. It's some other issue that is a barrier. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
So anyway, so we have these. Obviously, we have these. We're in the issue identification. So we'll identify gaps, good work in terms of information, and good work barriers in terms of. Barriers and good work in terms of. So that will actually just identify gaps, barriers, good work, and then there's these. There are 2 quadrants at the bottom for both that, either there's no information or it's not that important, but there's just still kind of interesting areas to think about. Because if there's no information that's not important, we may be missing something, and we don't want to rule that out per se. Also interesting is, for decisions, is there an overkill in some place in the rescale in the right-hand quadrant, or is this actually an effective use of science? We're not imagining we'll get a whole bunch of these in the workshop, but you never know. And so once we identify the things, that's the first step. But we want to elaborate on those things. We want to ask the questions, not just that there is a gap, but we want to know, we want to come up with recommendations. We want to find out not just, well, I have information. What is that information? So that second step, that pivot, is important in the issue elaboration. So we're imagining that we'll be we're not imagining. We will be asking specific questions to the workshop people about where they, put their, where they talked about their management issue and their human factors and what the gaps are in the good work. So we'll actually get behind that mark on the grid and come up with some information that's the context behind those things. And this is the issue elaboration is the learning portion of it. It's the learning for us. It's the learning for the people in the room. It's the place where we get recommendation. It's the place where perhaps people learn something. So, that is step 2, is the issue elaboration. And I just want to step back and say, we have this, since we had a question, we have this barriers issue, and we're imagining the barriers issue could be broad. It could be a policy barrier, it could be a decision barrier, it could be funding. So we want to have a broad look at barriers. And the last thing that we're going to touch on in our workshops is future information needs. And how will your future information needs change due to climate change? Oh, that's changed twice, but so we want to know how land managers feel and how we want to talk through what they think their information needs will be going forward. And that will be the last portion of our workshop. And now I'm finished with my portion of it, so I guess questions. We're on to questions.
So this is based on the Lemieux methodology, right, that you guys, so for people on the phone, there's a paper, and I can share it, or Rudy, either one of us, that Rudy's on. It's Lemieux et al. 2013, I believe, right? Where they did this approach in northern Colorado and southwest South Dakota. And it's a really good paper. It's an interesting paper. So how does the methodology, how is it the same or different in terms of, because wasn't that research using surveys?
There were some workshops for that too, where there were surveys and workshops for that. This method has been used a few times. We also used it assessing science and information needs for oil and gas leasing on the outer continental shelf in Alaska in the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas, where we did a series of workshops up there with 5 different stakeholder groups, industry, nonprofit organizations, state, tribal, and federal folks. And we did the same sort of thing up there to look at what are the information needs that you need in order, that the government, Department of Interior needs in order to allow leases to go up there. We also used it to organize information for the Deepwater Horizon investigator workshops and meetings. So, Deepwater Horizon occurred, a bunch of funding went out to conduct science. A year later, they had a workshop coming back. At the first workshop, right away, they said, what are the information needs? And they threw them all out there. A whole bunch of funding sources went out. So I was fortunate enough to be involved going into the second set of workshops to then evaluate the status of the research and the information coming back. And we used the same method where we broke the science or groups into various themes, and then social science and being one of the themes, and then working there to see what the importance and information needs are after the research has been going on as well.
I think, though, we've added the barriers portion.
Right.
And I don't think, did the Lemieux paper, they didn't also deal with policy barriers or management barriers of some sort. So we're adding that portion because we want this to be functional, and obviously, you could have all the information in the world and not actually be able to implement something. Or so the barriers portion is a new part of the study. And also, this is being looked at in a little bit different way. It's much more broad than the Chukchi and the leasing. It's a broader look at a whole bunch of issues. So.
I have a question on the previous slide. If you ask this question, you're clearly going to get just blank looks.
Right.
If you don't have some prompting or some primers. So how are you going to kind of, I would think you need, similar to way the Park Service scenario planning or the vulnerability assessment kind of things they've done, brings to the managers some kind of summary of climate information relative to their conservation targets. Water is predicted to go down, or evaporation is going up, and so I guess I was kind of wondering how you would bring in the climate information customized to the workshop, and then kind of solicit more of a kind of exchange on that question more than just kind of like dropping it on them.
Yeah, and I mean we've been going through this kind of quickly, so we didn't know how much detailed information we would get through, but we definitely realized that we've gone through a whole bunch of different ways to touch the future climate change issue, and because we deal almost exclusively, not almost exclusively, a lot of our stuff deals with the adaptation portion of climate change. And so in that case, there are these chains of, the manager is not necessarily managing for climate change. They're managing for water scarcity, or they're managing for fire, which is obviously influenced by the climate, but we can't say, well, go out and manage for climate. They're going to manage for that, for the thing in front of their face. And so we've gone through a whole bunch of things, and so we thought that, I don't know, we've gone back and forth so many times on that.
It might be just a matter of semantics, like asking something like, what types of questions will you have about how this climate will change your resource? And through that, you'll get at what kinds of information they need. But if you ask them blankly, what are your information needs, you're probably not going to get that answer. You're probably, like Jeff said, you're probably going to get blank stares.
Right, and
this procedural thing, before we get into more questions, which I think there are probably plenty, is there more to this presentation, or is this?
No, that's where we are.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess what I failed to say at the beginning is we haven't collected the data yet.
Okay.
This is the pilot. This is what we're piloting in the Rio Grande. So we're still designing and working up, and in the process of identifying stakeholders. And really, the question, Jeff, is great because this is the last phase and the least developed piece of the actual workshop. So we haven't gotten much past saying, we really want to know something about the future and how we can prepare for, if we can identify a gap today, and try and move towards filling a few of them, that would be great. And if we can somehow prepare for the future of this, would be even better.
Because, through some of the experience and some of the workshops that we've had, and actually, let me ask Linda Joyce to comment on this, is that some of the ways that we've solicited sort of people to think about the future from past experience, she actually was able to tease that out by asking, sending out some homework to participants, to stakeholders, to reflect on past weather events that challenged their ability to manage today. And then as we projected in the future, we started thinking about how some of these barriers were overcome or needed to be overcome with sort of future events. So I don't know if you want to share some of that, Linda?
Yeah, basically what it was is, for some of the workshops that Dennis and I have been involved with, the resource managers haven't practiced, if you will, talking about climate change. And so rather than hitting them over the head with, how will your information needs change in the future due to climate change, what we tried to get them to think about is if they had a weather event in the past. And both of those workshops that Rudy mentioned, at least I know for the one in the Black Hills, we had some of that discussion. And so we asked them, what have you experienced in the past? What kind of information did you need then? Did you get it? What kind of information could you have used then? And would you do anything different? And so, they have to think about the same questions that you're asking, but in the past. And then we moved after that to talking about the future. So.
And so, Linda, this is Nina. So, Linda, you asked people to think about that in advance of the workshop? This was something you sent out ahead of time?
It is in advance of the workshop, Nina, and I must say that for resource managers, I understand from talking to a couple other people that it was important to ask them prior to the workshop to write out what their experience was. And so they actually sent me their homework before the workshop. And then what I did, which is kind of, I think, what Rudy and his colleague are trying to get at here, is I looked at those questions and I thought, now what is it about this past experience that I would like them to tease out in the workshop? And so then during the workshop, we take about an hour and we go through some of the workshop, some of the homeworks that people had submitted. And so by looking at their homework ahead of time, I could actually pull out what I wanted. So sometimes it was, did you have institutional memory here based on this learning experience? Or others it was, you know, did you get the information you needed? Do you have it now? And, you know, a homework exercise like that might be helpful to take these questions that you're trying to get at here and reframe them so that when I interviewed people during the workshop, when you interview those people during the workshop, they can actually practice answering that question about the past for what you would like them to think about in the future.
Yeah, and we, you know, when designing this method, that's one of the things that we thought about doing with those importance performance questions and trying to solicit, and as well as tagging them to management challenges for people and asking people, you know, one of the options is exactly what you're saying, sending something out to them prior saying, you know, what are some of the top 3 management challenges that you're associated with and what are the human, you know, and get that homework beforehand and then jumping right in. We were going back and forth with burden on the respondent versus quality of time spent.
I think your questions would be interesting to ask them about a historical, you know, something they've experienced. But I would caution you about asking them to give you 3 examples, because when you ask for only 1, you know, you get less information in terms of sort of a number of cases, but you get a deeper perspective about what their past experience was, and I think that might really inform you as you try to think about what their future is. I liked the first 2 questions. I thought they were, you know, they'd help me when I was doing these workshops.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. As Rudy said, we have talked about either pre-work or post-work, and I think that, you know, this is the part of the workshop that's kind of given us the most heartburn, so that's a good way to think about it. So that's
another thing to think about, maybe, it seems like it's a little bit different, but maybe complementary to that, the extreme event, is to say how much does your management assume things will be the same? And then by things, you could be more explicit. How much does your management assume similar temperatures? How much does your management assume similar vegetation phenology? Does it assume dryness or spring, not just weather and the things, but the timing of those weather events? Especially in the Rio Grande, there's probably kind of a monsoonal issue of, you know, if that comes later, different or more extreme, you know. Just to know if they're even, you know, if they, that might start them thinking about it. Because if they haven't observed, you know, if their memory's short enough or they're kind of new enough, they don't really have an extreme event, they might be kind of thinking things are always going to be the same. And so not managing with an assumption of kind of a stationary climate when it's probably not going to be, but no, it isn't.
So I think that's a good question, Jeff. This is Linda again. But I think I'd be a little careful of people confounding weather and climate. And so we've actually gone into planning documents and looked at where they've used weather or climate as a threshold for management. And if there's any way you could do that for the Rio Grande, then turning that question around and presenting that to the stakeholders, I think, would get them thinking about more about the question that Jeff just asked.
So this is Dennis, and I was wondering if, as you look at the barriers, what mechanisms or how are you going to tease out mechanisms to overcome barriers? Is that
how, or are we going to?
Are you going to, or how, I mean, just getting, you know, sort of within the having a group of stakeholders and managers together, sort of how is it that you plan to sort of get at that question of how to overcome barriers or gaps.
The issue elaboration point. So the idea is that those three components that Kyle spoke about, the issue identification, elaboration, and then finally futures, during that issue elaboration is where we'll actually do that. So for part one, you know, it's a workshop, so there are going to be people in there. We'll do the sticky note thing and identifying what are the issues, where do they belong on the grid, and that sort of thing. And then we can step back and look at all of those issues that are, you know, the information and the barriers. So they're doing it for both of those things. And then the second part of the whole workshop is actually talking about those points that are on the grid. And that's where then we talk about the issue and the information gaps or needs associated with that. And then we also spend time talking about the barriers and trying to elicit. So there are, you know, structured time in a workshop for identification, structured time in the workshop for actually elaborating on those various topics.
And there might actually be a good thing that the disagreement on certain issues might actually bring about how people overcame barriers. So in talking about things, there may be something that says, you know, we have a high barrier here, and there may be a portion where someone overcame that barrier. Now, obviously, we haven't done the workshop. We don't know if that will actually happen. But those disagreements, although they may seem like they're throwing us off a bit, may actually be very positive in, you know, oh, we did this, and this is what happened.
Because what comes to mind, too, is that given the complexity within the social ecological framing of things, that having someone as a group of facilitators to actually monitor the differential biases that various stakeholders, because academics who are ecologists might have ecological barriers that they kind of focus on, but some of the issues related to some of the institutional policy, you know, the social network kind of components, would be useful to listen to what the stakeholders are saying, but then also ask questions about what about this dimension, and actually almost have something there as a useful, you know, template of saying, you know, let's make sure that we cover this full breadth of the social ecological system, because I know, and you know, you get some of these discussions going, you start going down a path that it just almost goes too deep on one dimension, and you got to bring them back out and say,
oh gosh, yeah, we're struggling with time management on this. Just trying to, you know.
So having it, you know, presenting, so I say this is a social ecological system that we're looking at. We're looking at these multiple divisions. We're looking at multiple jurisdictions, and you know, as you guys being the facilitators, say making sure that you have balance as you look at these, you know, responses and things. You know, just say, you know, you know, what about the multi-jurisdictional aspects of this? It's not just an ecological problem, right? So how do you know? And some of the ecological problems are intractable. So how do we actually then, within the context, how do we actually look at how do we, you know, develop, you know, more networked solutions and things like that.
Yeah, and there's some literature on this, so I think we would have that as kind of a prompt, as you're suggesting, I think. So we don't want to say, these are the barriers, tell us if you're experiencing them. Like, we wouldn't do that. Yeah. But if we can see that there's a whole category of barriers that people just aren't getting to, then you would say, well, you know, some people think that these kinds of, this category thing also presents some barriers. Have you experienced it? Let's have that conversation.
Right. And
that's kind of what you mean, I think. Right? Yeah.
And trying to get past the, you know, time, funding, and staffing. You know, put those up there.
You can talk about these.
Given. One comment, and probably goes without saying, given the people in this room and the people participating in the WebEx, is that this, as much cross-fertilization of this in the Southwest Colorado project that can happen. I know that the Southwest Colorado is doing interviews and what is it? Interviews, focus groups, workshops. So a little bit different strategy getting at some of these things, but obviously the more cross-fertilization, the better.
Oh, yeah.
There's a little bit of overlap in study areas.
So we have a call every first and third Tuesday with the working group for this. So the structure of this group is, you know, an interagency collaborative. So we have a group of about 8 or 10 people who get together and think really grand thoughts about this on every first and third Tuesday, and then we here at Fort Collins try and put that pen to paper and keep moving it forward. And Linda, anybody else who'd like to help and become involved in this, drop an email. You know, the folks, yeah, I'm not sure, I just keep giving kudos to that working team of folks.
Okay. So we're about ready to wrap up, I think.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Did anyone else on the phone have anything they wanted to share before we hang up?
This is Lisa. I know that you guys probably have already seen this, but I think Kelly Archie's paper had a bunch of barriers from the survey that she did, and so I know you don't want to bias what people are saying, and I really appreciate the way you're going about it. But that just might be interesting. I totally hear you too on the funding, staffing. That always seem to rise to the top in our studies too. But there were some really interesting ones that were farther down that if you want to look for some categories to prompt people with, they came up, you know, from those bigger surveys too.
Yeah.
Which paper? Do you know which paper?
I know what it is.
Okay.
Yeah, it's Archie et al. I forget the year, but yeah, Shannon's got all those.
Thanks. National Climate Assessment paper. I sent Rudy.
Yep.
I think I copied you.
Yeah, we've sent them around that way.
Yeah. So there's that one that has a whole table on barriers, and there's a lot of literature coming out on barriers. So
yeah.
But I can send that Archie paper around too, Lisa, with the limited
Sure.
paper.
Yeah, you have it already, right? Up there, or I think you already have it. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Thanks, Lisa.
Anybody else? Going once. Going twice.
Promo for the next one?
I don't know.
When we have the next one scheduled?
No, not yet. No.
Oh, I thought we had these lined up.
No.
I'm thinking of something else. Stay tuned for the
calls lined up.
Yeah, we've got more calls and monitors than we know what to do with.
So stay tuned for the next one.
Yeah, so I'll send out the papers and the link for the recordings. So thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.